Hi guys. So in this video we're going to quickly go through and talk about the nephron, which is the really small tubule that we basically fills the entire kidney. And we're going to talk about how it goes through the process of filtering blood, what reabsorption is, secretion, and basically reabsorbing water. We're going to do all of those things in this video. So basically covering just the function of the nephron. So remember when we drew out the kidney, it looks like this. And inside of the actual structure of the kidney, it has tiny little tubules that make up all of this kind of darker colored tissue. So we're going to go and zoom in on this structure called the nephron. We're going to learn about the parts of it and what it specifically does. So remember, the kidney is made up of like thousands of these nephrons working all together to basically filter all the waste from our blood and create urine. So number one, the kidney functions as a filter. So the very first structure that we have in the actual nephron is called the glomerulus, and it is basically like a coffee filter. So blood passes beside it, and all of the large things like proteins and red blood cells and larger molecules are not going to be allowed into the actual nephron. It's impermeable to things that are large because it has certain size holes, just like a coffee filter doesn't allow the coffee grains into the liquid below. The glomerulus acts as that. It is permeable to things like water and smaller things like glucose and things like urea. Remember, urine is made up primarily of something called urea, which is basically a byproduct of ammonia. It's a nitrogenous waste that we want to get rid of, and small molecules and other things like ions like sodium and chloride and other ions that we'll talk about a little bit later. So once the bigger structures like blood cells and proteins and things like that get filtered out, we start to call the fluid, instead of calling it blood, we call it filtrate, and it moves into what we call the Bowmans Capsule, which is the next structure in our nephron. Again, I'm going to be making a picture with you guys at the end of this video of what a nephron looks like, but just kind of going through what it does first. It also acts as a tubule. So basically we use that word to describe the device that reabsorbs things back into our blood. So things that we actually want to keep, such as glucose and water and ions that we use for certain things like calcium, we use for muscle contractions and blood clotting. If calcium ends up in our nephron, we want to absorb that back into our body. So things that are in this actual tubule that we want to make sure goes back into our blood, we would reabsorb those things. And the tubule would also secrete, which means keep in the actual nephron and eventually end up in our urine, substances that we want to get rid of, the waste substances like a urea, and if we have excess of any ion that we don't need, we would be getting rid of that as well. We also act as a duct. So in this, we use this duct that we empty things that didn't make it through into the actual nephron. We empty some of the things into it after it goes through the glomerulus from the blood. So we use this in making sure that we have the right amount of water in our body. So if, for example, you're a little bit dehydrated, we can take water and we can reabsorb it into our body. If we have excess water, we can keep it in our nephron and eventually end up in our urine, and our urine will be really dilute. And the filtrate is now called urine. So at the end of all the process, we collect the urine in the renal pelvis, and eventually it will go down the ureters and into our urinary bladder. So the actual process that happens at the nephron is basically broken down into 4 steps. So make sure you write down these 4 steps with me. So first, it filtrates in the glomerulus. Between the blood and the glomerulus, it's going to filter all of the larger molecules. It's going to reabsorb the things that we don't actually want to get rid of. Okay, things that were useful in our body, we're going to reabsorb it back into our blood. It's going to secrete the wastes, and it's also going to reabsorb water. So those 4 things need to happen in the nephron at certain places in the nephron in order for this whole function, the whole process to work properly. So this is the picture that we're going to be drawing that you guys have on the page that's empty that says draw a nephron. So this is kind of the outline if you want to start drawing that, and then we're going to label the parts just so that in my next video when I go through what each part is doing, you know at least the parts of the nephron. So starting with the glomerulus. The glomerulus is actually an extension of blood vessels. Again, it kind of acts as a filtration device like a coffee filter, and fluid would go from the blood into the glomerulus. If it's large, it stays in the blood. If it's small, it can go across into the Bowmans capsule, which kind of looks like a half moon shape. And then it would move into this structure, which is called the proximal tubule, and move down into this structure then. Okay, this entire little part that drops down is called the loop of Henle. But because this part's going down and then this part's going to go up, we have different names for it. So the part that goes down is called the descending loop of Henle, just like we have the descending aorta. And then the next part is the ascending loop of Henle, or like we had the ascending aorta. Ascending just means going up, and descending means going down. So we'll start in the glomerulus, then we go into the Bowman's capsule, then into the proximal tubule, the descending loop of Henle, the ascending loop of Henle, and then into the distal tubule. And then this structure at the very end is called the collecting duct. So all of the collecting ducts will lead into the renal pelvis and eventually into a ureter, and then we can collect all the urine in the urinary bladder. So that is the entire structure of the actual nephron. There's also blood vessels that run beside it. So we just have to make sure that we have the blood vessels labeled. When we have the blood that's actually going to the nephron, this would be part of the renal artery. And then the blood that's going away from the nephron that's now been filtered would be the renal vein, which would then lead back towards our heart. But the blood in the renal vein would be the stuff that has all of the waste removed and all the good stuff left over in it. So that should be the picture that you guys have on that page. Tomorrow I'm going to specifically talk about each structure, so the glomerulus, the proximal tubule, the loop of Henle, the collecting duct, all those things. I'm going to be talking about what is happening in each structure, what are they reabsorbing, what are they secreting, and that is kind of the main key thing that you need to know from this video, is just understanding what's happening at each place, and I would say is the most important thing that you need to know in Chapter 9. So we'll do that tomorrow. Hopefully this makes sense. Have a great night, guys. Talk to you later.